So as you were told, I'm Eldridge of Griff Birmingham. I'm the Chief Science Officer of this magnificent museum that's being built around the corner on that dynamic edge between the Everglades and the Gulf Stream and sitting between the temperate zone and the tropic zone. We invite you all to come and welcome in about a year, but that's not the point tonight. I'm here to introduce Richard Dawkins, and first I have to tell you just a very quick tale. I was a student at Cornell University in the 70s when Selfish Gene came out, and I was on my way and actually started in veterinary college at Cornell University, and I became so enthralled with the book and with the conversation that ensued at Cornell around the book that I changed my own career direction and went into genetics. So I owe a lot to Richard Dawkins. So Richard Dawkins has been voted Prospect Magazine's #1 world thinker, quite an honor, has previously published 11 books, all still in print, including The Selfish Gene, the blockbuster bestseller The God Delusion, and obviously his magnum opus, The Ancestor's Tale. This is actually really remarkable when you think about it. Richard's a fellow of both the Royal Society and the Royal Society of Literature. He was the inaugural holder of the Simon E. Chair for the Public Understanding of Science at Oxford University, and is the recipient of numerous honorary degrees and awards, including the International Cosmos Prize of Japan, which I actually think is more incredible than the Nobel Prize, for those of you who know about the Cosmos Prize. In an appetite for wonder, the making of a scientist, Richard Dawkins shows a rare view into his early life, his intellectual awakening at Oxford, and his path to writing The Selfish Gene. Here for the first time is an intimate memoir of the childhood and intellectual development of the evolutionary biologist and world-famous atheist, and the story of how he came to write what is widely held to be one of the most important books of the 20th century. Professor Dawkins is also going to be joined on stage by Jeffrey Allen Lieberman, who holds the Lieber Chair and directs the Lieber Center for Schizophrenia Research in the Department of Psychiatry at Columbia, and serves as Psychiatrist-in-Chief of New York Presbyterian Hospital, Columbia University Medical Center. I'll leave it to all of you and to Dr. Lieberman to explain why we have somebody who studies schizophrenia interviewing Professor Richard Dawkins.
Thank you very much, Eldridge. I'm Jeffrey Lieberman, in case you didn't recognize or couldn't distinguish who was who. This is Professor Richard Dawkins. Eldridge, thank you for that. I will answer why a psychiatrist who studies schizophrenia is interviewing a scholar who has focused, in terms of one of his works, on the evolutionary significance of genes. But basically, it's all genetics, as Professor Dawkins has told us. Before we begin, I just want to say how pleased I am to be here and offer my gratitude to Michelle Kaplan, who's been the inspiration and co-founder of the Miami Book Fair, and also to Professor Padron, who is the president of Miami-Dade College, for hosting this event. It's truly a magnificent event and something for the city of Miami to be proud of. Eldridge introduced Professor Dawkins, which I could add to, but won't in the interest of saving time. We're going to talk for roughly a half an hour and then open the floor for a few minutes of questions. So ready yourself if you're inclined to ask a question. The reason we're here tonight is because Professor Dawkins, in addition to his academic and scientific research, has been inclined to speak to the public and educate the public about scientific issues, but also about non-scientific issues from the perspective of a scientist. And that's something that's not easy to do, and not many of his scientific colleagues are inclined to do. Alan Alda, famous actor, who's a good friend of mine, is an admiration of scientists who do this, and said not enough do it or are able to do it. So I want to first thank Professor Dawkins for his prodigious output and really putting himself into the sort of battlefield of the public arena by trying to speak and communicate scientific, complex issues to to the public, or even non-scientific ways, issues in a way that involves sort of rigorous scientific analysis. Now, Professor Dawkins has written 12 books now. The reason we're here tonight is because of this one, his memoir, which is An Appetite for Wonder, The Making of a Scientist. And this is a departure from what he's done before in his prior 11 books, beginning with The Selfish Gene. I guess I would sort of start by asking, this is a memoir. In reading it, I wouldn't say surprised, but pleasantly sort of to find that this is truly a memoir of actually what your life was like, from at least your ancestry and birth up until publication of The Selfish Gene and immediately thereafter. And I noticed that one of the endorsements that you had in the book was from The Guardian, where they said, quote, a surprisingly intimate and moving book. So, why now? Why, after having written scientifically for academia and for the public in the way that you have, why was it time to write a memoir?
I suppose it's time to write a memoir because I'm still alive. And more to the point, actually, my mother is still alive at the age of 98, and so she has an excellent memory, and so I was able to tap her memory for my childhood, and indeed the book includes a few extracts from her diaries. Why does anyone write a memoir? I mean, it's a sort of rather presumptuous thing to suppose that anybody would want to read. Who on earth wants to read a memoir about me, if you see what I mean? In fact, one of the more hostile reviews that I got in an English paper says something like, the trouble with this autobiography is it seems to be all about the author. Yes, I don't know really why now. I vaguely had it in mind that it might be a good idea, but I suppose the honest answer is that the publishers wanted it.
And we're certainly glad they invited you to do this. I confess to having certainly been familiar with you and your work, particularly from having read The Selfish Gene. But in reading this book, I became aware of what truly is an amazing life you've had. I mean, you have had an extraordinary range of experiences and family and colleagues to contribite and to interact with over the course of your life. Your ancestry, which is depicted in the pedigree in the initial pages of the book, is quite fascinating. Your ethnic, racial origins are from England, but you were born in Kenya. You then moved to South Africa. You then returned to England, where you, for the most part, remained, except for a stint in Berkeley. And you had educational experiences beginning in Rhodesia at Eagle, and then at Chaffin Grove in England, and then Oudle, and then another public school in England, and then on to Oxford and Balliol College, UC Berkeley, and back to Oxford. It seems that it really was an amazing life, which in some way had to have contributed to who you became and what you've been able to do. Was it really that good, or did you leave anything out?
Well, it's very nice to have an interviewer who's obviously read the book. Yes, I wouldn't say that actually my childhood foreshadowed very much my becoming a scientist. I sort of feel I was a bit of a late developer, and it wasn't until I got to Oxford as an undergraduate that I really became obsessed with science. And even then, it wasn't the natural history aspects of science that intrigued me, but rather the philosophical ones. I was intrigued by the deep questions of existence. Why is there life at all? What's it all about? What's it for? And I early decided that biology, evolution especially, was the right way to answer that kind of question. I don't know whether my life's that fascinating. Doesn't everybody have an interesting life? I suppose I was born in Africa, which not everybody was. Though our species was, by the way. So in a way, I went back to not just my roots, but everybody's roots. My foundation, the Richard Dawkins Foundation for Reason and Science, has a T-shirt which says, "We are all Africans." And it means that all humans, we're all a brotherhood and sisterhood. We're all close relatives, and we all hail from the dark continent of Africa.
Your family moved to England when you were 8, but prior to that you were in South Africa and you went to legal school in Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. Even at that young age, did you have some particular sort of experience or recollections given the political circumstances of apartheid?
No, not really. It was actually Nyasaland, which was a British colony, which is just a little bit north of South Africa. So, but although there was no apartheid, there was the typical British imperial racism in the sense of a kind of patronizing condescension to the Africans. We lived a life of sort of Edwardian, almost Victorian gentry with servants, and the men were called boys. So it was a patronizing. They were kind of. I wouldn't say that they were treated badly, but they were treated with condescension as though they were children. Which is, in a way, a more insidious kind of racism, I suppose you could say. And I'm sure this was true of the whole British Empire, probably the French Empire and the Dutch Empire and things as well. And that really didn't change until, well, probably the 1950s.
But your first seminal publication, Republic, the Selfish Gene, introduced a new sort of thesis to expand our understanding of the mechanism of evolution, and that is through genetics. In this, genes are the currency of evolution and play a role as the medium or the mechanistic medium by which selective pressures, natural selection, is brought to bear on evolution. So, in some ways, you wrote this in 1976.
Yes.
It was really prescient because, as a physician who studies human disease in the wake of the sequencing of the genome, which occurred in 2003, our whole understanding of the role of genetics, the diverse way in which genes, DNA chromosomes can express themselves, has totally transformed our opinion about how we understand illness, how we understand sort of human biology of life. And you had anticipated this in the context of your evolutionary biological career, which is quite extraordinary. I'm not sure if that's yet been fully appreciated, how you had sort of foreseen this. But in order to become a little more entertaining for the audience, let me try and come back to the autobiographical stuff and get a little personal. Your father was a botanist, your mother was a naturalist. Some orientation. You've been married 3 times.
Yes.
You're currently married. You have 1 daughter.
Yes.
The thesis of the selfish gene is that the way evolution works is that genes are inclined to perpetuate themselves through procreation.
Yes, I think the point here is that we see animals and plants as bodies, as great big things which walk around and do things and grow and so on. But what's really going on is information, digital information. It's just like computer information, which in our kind of life is DNA. And it's only DNA that actually survives. When you talk about the survival of the fittest, when you talk about the struggle for existence, bodies do struggle for existence, but they don't struggle for perpetual existence. They struggle only to reproduce. They struggle to survive, and they struggle to reproduce. And that means they struggle to pass on the digital information that built them in the first place. The genes that are now inside us potentially can go on for millions of years in the form of exact copies of themselves with occasional inexactitude, which is mutation. And because genes are potentially immortal, because they're in the information form, they're potentially immortal, that means that the ones that are successful in surviving go on forever, or for a very, very long time, forever compared to ordinary generation time. Successful genes go on through future generations, unsuccessful ones don't. Bodies are just the temporary throwaway survival machines for the genes that built them and that ride inside them. And because they ride inside them, the death of the body is the death of the gene. The failure of the body to reproduce is the failure of the genes to get through into the next generation. So what we see as we look around the world is bodies that were made by successful genes, and by successful I mean very strictly successful at making ancestors. Another way to look at it is that every living creature is descended from an unbroken line of successful ancestors. Every single one of your ancestors succeeded in achieving at least one heterosexual copulation. And that's not true of the great majority of animals that have ever lived. Most animals that have ever lived have either died young or failed to get a mate. So we are all descended from an elite of organisms that have, back to the beginning of life, an elite lineage that has succeeded in every single generation in surviving long enough to reproduce and then reproducing. So we, all of us, whether we're humans or bats or wombats or hippopotamuses or pine trees, we all of us carry the genes that make us good at what we do. And what we do, in the case of bats, is flying, in the case of dolphins is swimming, in the case of moles is digging, in the case of gibbons is swinging by their arms through the treetops, and in the case of humans is thinking. So all different species do it a different way, but fundamentally they're all doing exactly the same thing, which is working to preserve the genetic instructions that made them in the first place, and that ride inside them as the vehicle that they ride inside. And their fate is bound up in the fate of the vehicle that they built. So they better be good at building vehicles, better be good at building bodies, or they wouldn't be here. And they are here, or we wouldn't see them. So all the animals that we see are good at doing what they do, or potentially good at doing what they do, because they are descended from an unbroken line of successful ancestors and inherit the genes that made them successful.
So genes are the replicators, and bodies, whether they be animals or humans or plants, are the vehicles. Why didn't you have more children?
Well, I am not a believer in the idea that because natural selection, genetic selection, is what gives us existence, that should dictate what we ought to do. It's perfectly true that we are programmed, like all animals and all plants, to spend all our time and all our energy in struggling to reproduce. But the great glory of the human species is that we have, through the process of evolution by natural selection, acquired brains that are big enough to emancipate themselves from the struggles that gave rise to them in the first place. Steven Pinker, the great linguist and psychologist, put it well when he said, "I do not intend to reproduce, and if my selfish genes don't like it, they can go jump in the lake." this is actually quite a serious point. Two points I'd make. One is a kind of political point, that if we really did all govern